Somewhere in this country, right now, someone is walking to their mailbox. Nothing dramatic, no ladder, no icy sidewalk, no dramatic slip. They step off a curb they've stepped off 1,000 times before, and something gives. A hip, a wrist, a bone that had no business breaking from a fall that short. By the time the ambulance gets there, the real damage isn't the fracture. The real damage happened years earlier, quietly, with no pain, no warning, and no symptom anyone was ever taught to look for. The bone had already been thinning for a decade. Nobody knew, not even the person it was happening to. I'm Dr. Walter Hale. I've spent nearly 4 decades practicing medicine, and if there's one condition I've watched do more damage while announcing itself less than almost anything else I treat, it's this one. Doctors have a name for it that tells you everything you need to know, the silent disease. It doesn't ache, it doesn't swell, it doesn't show up on the mirror the way weight does, or on a blood pressure cuff the way heart strain does. It just quietly removes the scaffolding your entire body depends on, 1 year at a time, until the day it finally announces itself, usually with a break that changes everything. Here's what almost nobody gets told at a regular checkup. By the time bone loss is visible on a standard X-ray, you have typically already lost 30 to 40% of the bone density in that area. 30 to 40% gone before the most common imaging tool in a doctor's office can even see it. That's not a small gap in detection. That's most of the disease happening entirely in the dark. Today I want to walk you through 5 signs your body may already be showing you right now that your bones are losing ground. None of them are the obvious ones you've already heard 100 times. None of them require a hospital visit to notice. And the 5th one, the one I'm going to end on, is the sign that sends more people into my exam room in a state of genuine shock than almost any other. Because by the time they notice it, they assume it's already too late to matter. It usually isn't, but you need to know it when you see it. Before we start, I want to ask you something, and I mean this genuinely. How old are you, and has a bone in your body ever broken from something that, looking back, really shouldn't have been enough to break it? A short fall, a bump into furniture, catching yourself the wrong way? Write it in the comments. I read every one, and it tells me exactly what this audience actually needs from me next. Before we get into the 5 signs themselves, I want to give you 30 seconds on how bone actually works, because once you understand this one mechanism, every single sign on this list will make sense instantly, instead of feeling like 5 random, disconnected facts. Your bones are not the dead, inert scaffolding most people picture when they hear the word skeleton. They are living, active tissue, being constantly broken down and rebuilt your entire life through 2 types of cells working in a kind of ongoing renovation. One type, called osteoclasts, breaks down old bone tissue and clears it away. The other, called osteoblasts, moves in behind them and builds new bone tissue to replace it. In your 20s and into your early 30s, the builders generally outwork the demolition crew, and your bone density holds steady or even climbs. Somewhere around your 40s, that balance starts to tip. The demolition crew keeps working at roughly the same pace. The builders slow down. And for women, that tipping point accelerates sharply in the years immediately following menopause, when a major drop in estrogen, a hormone that plays a direct protective role in slowing down that demolition crew, removes one of the body's key brakes on bone loss almost overnight, in biological terms. Here's why this matters for everything we're about to cover. This entire process happens on the inside of the bone, invisible from the outside, with no nerve endings there to send you a pain signal telling you it's happening. There is no warning system built into this process. The only way most people find out is when the external evidence finally shows up, in the 5 places we're about to walk through. Let's start with sign number 5, because it's the one most people notice and then talk themselves out of. Number 5. You're not as tall as you used to be. Most people who lose height blame gravity, blame posture, blame just getting older, the same vague way we blame everything we don't understand. Here's what's actually happening underneath that explanation. Your spine is a stack of individual bones, called vertebrae, cushioned between discs, holding your entire upper body upright against gravity all day, every day, for your entire life. When the bone tissue inside those vertebrae weakens, The front edge of one or more of them can begin to compress under ordinary, everyday load, not from an accident, not from a fall, from simply standing, walking, and living in a body that weighs what it weighs. This is called a compression fracture, and here is the detail that surprises almost everyone I explain this to. It frequently causes no sharp, dramatic pain at all. Sometimes there's a dull ache people write off as a bad night's sleep. Sometimes there's nothing they notice in the moment whatsoever. The only evidence, months or years later, is that the tape measure says something different than it used to, and the mirror shows a person standing very slightly shorter than the one from an old photograph. The number to know is this: losing more than 1.5 inches of height over your adult life is a recognized clinical marker doctors are trained to take seriously, precisely because it so often reflects vertebral compression that never announced itself any other way. If you genuinely don't know your height from 10 or 20 years ago, that's worth finding out. Old driver's licenses work. Old medical charts work. It's a 5-minute piece of detective work that can tell you something your spine has been trying to tell you for years. Here's a simple way to actually track it instead of guessing. Stand against a wall, without shoes, once a month, and mark the real number. A small, gradual change tracked over time tells you far more than trying to remember what a doctor said a decade ago. Number 4. Your posture has quietly curved forward, and you've started to notice it in photographs before you noticed it in the mirror. This one builds directly on the last one, and it's the sign families tend to spot before the person living inside that body ever does, because we adjust to our own posture gradually enough that it stops registering as a change. It just becomes normal. But other people, especially people who haven't seen you in 6 months or a year, see it immediately. When one vertebra compresses, the spine can usually still compensate and keep you standing reasonably straight. When several vertebrae along the upper back have quietly compressed over the years, the spine loses that ability to compensate, and the upper back begins to round forward. Clinically, it's called kyphosis. Informally, for generations, families have simply called it a stooped back, or a rounded back, and treated it as an inevitable part of getting old. The same way we've been trained to treat height loss as inevitable, it is not simply cosmetic, and this is the part I really want you to sit with. A forward curved upper spine changes how your ribcage sits, which can make full, deep breathing measurably harder. It shifts your center of gravity forward, which is directly connected to a higher risk of losing your balance and falling, which brings us right back to the same bones that are already weakened in the first place. It becomes a cycle. Weaker bones lead to curved posture leads to worse balance leads to a fall, and a fall lands on bone that was never strong enough to absorb it. Catching this early, while it's still mild, is dramatically easier than trying to reverse it once it's established. The most useful thing you can do here isn't a mirror check, honestly. It's asking someone who doesn't see you every day whether your posture has changed over the last year or two. We are genuinely the worst judges of our own gradual changes. Someone who sees you occasionally will often notice this before you ever do. Number 3, and this is the one that genuinely surprises most people I explain it to, including plenty of people who consider themselves fairly health literate. How strong is your grip, right now, in your dominant hand? It sounds like it belongs in a conversation about arm strength, not bone density. But researchers in the field of geriatric medicine have spent years documenting something doctors on the front lines had already suspected from experience. Grip strength tracks closely with the overall health of your skeletal system, not just your muscles. There's even a recognized clinical term for when weakening bones and weakening muscle mass show up together in the same person at the same time, which they very often do: osteosarcopenia. The bones and the muscles that move them tend to decline together because they're responding to a lot of the same underlying hormonal and nutritional pressures as we age. A simple way to get a rough sense of where you stand: can you firmly, comfortably open a stubborn jar lid without asking for help, or has that quietly become a two-hand, full-effort production over the last couple of years? Can you carry a full grocery bag in one hand from the car to the kitchen the way you always have, or does your hand start to shake and lose its hold halfway there? These aren't dramatic medical tests. They're the small, ordinary tasks your hands have been doing your whole life, and a real decline in how easily you do them is worth paying attention to, not brushing off as a bad day. One inexpensive tool makes this easy to actually track rather than guess at: a hand grip dynamometer, the kind physical therapists use. It gives you a real number to watch over months, and numbers don't let you talk yourself out of a change the way a feeling can. Number 2, and I want to be honest with you, this is the sign that has almost nothing to do with what you'd expect, and it's the one I've watched catch the most intelligent, health-conscious patients completely off guard. Have your gums been receding? Has your dentist mentioned in passing that you're losing some bone around your teeth, or that your gum line has pulled back further than it used to sit? Your jawbone is bone tissue, exactly like your hip, your spine, and your wrist. It responds to the same hormonal shifts, the same mineral demands, and the same aging processes as the rest of your skeleton. Dental researchers have found a real, documented connection between the density of the jawbone and the density of bone tissue elsewhere in the body, particularly in women after menopause, when estrogen, a hormone that plays a major protective role in maintaining bone density throughout the body, drops sharply. When the jawbone thins, the gum tissue that depends on it for support can recede, teeth can loosen, and what looks purely like a dental problem is, underneath, a skeletal one. Most people walk out of a dental appointment having heard about their gums and never once connected it to the rest of their body. Your dentist is not typically the one who's going to make that connection out loud for you. I am. If a dentist ever mentions this to you, don't let it stay a dental-only note. Ask them to put it in writing and carry it to your regular physician yourself. Those two charts almost never talk to each other on their own, and right now, you may be the only one who can connect them. Quick pause, because I owe you the same honesty every time. If any of this is landing for you, hit subscribe and leave a like. It genuinely helps this reach more people who need to hear it before their first fracture, not after. And tell me in the comments, has a dentist ever mentioned bone loss or gum recession to you? I want to know how common this actually is among the people watching. Now, number 1, the sign that sends people into my office in a state of real shock, because by the time it happens, they assume the conversation is already over. Number 1, you've already broken a bone from something minor. I want you to really sit with what minor means here, because this is the detail that changes everything about how seriously this should be taken. Not a car accident, not a fall down a full flight of stairs, a step off a curb, a trip over a doorway threshold, catching your hip on the corner of a kitchen counter, a wrist that broke catching yourself on level ground. In medicine, we call this a fragility fracture, and it has a very specific, very serious meaning. It is a break that occurs from a force your bone should have been able to absorb without any damage at all. A healthy bone in a person with normal density does not typically break from stepping off a curb. When it does, that fracture is not simply an unlucky accident. It is frequently the very first, unmistakable, undeniable piece of evidence that the bone had already been silently weakening for years before that moment, waiting for an ordinary piece of bad luck to reveal what was already true underneath the surface. Let me tell you about someone I'll call Helen, 74 years old, from a small town outside Columbus, Ohio. She's a composite drawn from a number of patients I've cared for over the years, not any single real person, so nobody's privacy is on the line here. But her story is one I've genuinely lived through more times than I can count. Helen came to see me after breaking her wrist. Not from a car accident, not from a bad fall on ice. She'd tripped, ever so slightly, on a garden hose in her own backyard, put her hand out to catch herself the way anyone would, and felt something snap that by every reasonable expectation should have simply absorbed the impact and let her carry on with her afternoon. She was furious with herself at first, told me she felt clumsy, careless, like she should have been paying more attention to where she was walking. I had to explain to her, gently, that the hose wasn't the problem. Her bones had been thinning for years, quietly, with no pain and no warning, and the hose was simply the ordinary piece of bad luck that finally exposed what had already been true for a long time. That wrist fracture wasn't the beginning of her bone problem. It was the first time her bone problem finally spoke up loud enough for anyone to hear it. We ran a bone density scan, the kind of imaging that actually can catch this early, unlike a standard X-ray. Hers showed significant loss, well beyond what her age alone would explain. We got her onto the right nutritional support, a targeted strength program built around the exact kind of resistance movement that tells bone tissue to rebuild rather than continue thinning, and regular monitoring going forward. 2 years later, her follow-up scan showed real, measurable improvement, not just a slowing of the loss, actual rebuilding. Her wrist healed completely, but what stayed with her, she told me, wasn't the wrist. It was realizing how long her body had been trying to tell her something, quietly, in ways she'd simply never been taught to recognize. According to the Bone Health and Osteoporosis Foundation, 1 in 2 women and up to 1 in 4 men over the age of 50 will break a bone in their lifetime because of weakening bone density. Read that again. 1 in 2 women, not a rare condition affecting a small, unlucky minority. A condition that statistically affects roughly half of the women in your own life eventually, and a meaningful share of the men too, most of whom will have no idea it's coming until the day it arrives as a fracture. Here is the piece I most want you to walk away with today, because it is genuinely hopeful, and I don't say that lightly. Bone is living tissue. It is constantly being broken down in small amounts and rebuilt in small amounts, your entire life, in a continuous cycle. In your 20s and 30s, the rebuilding side of that cycle generally wins, and your bones stay strong or even continue to strengthen. Somewhere around your 40s, and accelerating significantly for women in the years immediately following menopause, when postmenopausal women can lose bone density at a notably faster rate than at any other point in adult life. The breakdown side of that cycle starts to outpace the rebuilding side. But the rebuilding side never fully shuts off. It slows, it doesn't stop, and that means this is genuinely a process you can influence, not simply a sentence you passively wait out. So here is what I want you to actually do this week, not someday, this week. First, do the height check. Find an old ID, an old medical record, anything with a documented height from 10 or more years ago, and measure yourself today. More than 1.5 inches of difference is worth a real conversation with your doctor. Second, ask directly for a bone density scan, formerly called a DEXA scan, if you haven't had one and you're a woman over 65 or a man over 70, or younger than that if you've already had any fracture from a minor incident, or if osteoporosis runs in your family. This is not an unusual or excessive request. It is a standard, well-established screening tool, and plenty of people who qualify for one simply never think to ask. Third, bring calcium and vitamin D intake into the conversation with your doctor or a dietitian, because your body cannot build strong bone without adequate amounts of both, and deficiency in either one is extremely common in adults over 60. In practical terms, that means regularly including foods like plain yogurt, low-fat dairy, canned salmon or sardines eaten with the soft bones included, and leafy greens like kale or collard greens, alongside a few honest minutes of sunlight on bare skin most days, since your body actually manufactures much of its own vitamin D that way, rather than getting all of it from food. If your doctor checks a blood level and finds you low, a supplement is a reasonable, well-established next step, but it's worth confirming the actual number first rather than guessing. Fourth, add resistance and weight-bearing movement into your week, even in small amounts. Bone tissue responds directly to load. When you ask a muscle to work against resistance, the bone underneath that muscle receives a biological signal to reinforce itself, essentially telling those builder cells we talked about earlier to get back to work. This does not require a gym membership or heavy equipment. A simple, safe place to start. Standing up from a chair without using your hands 10 times in a row, once a day. It sounds almost too small to matter. It directly loads the hip and thigh bones, 2 of the most common fracture sites there are, every single time you do it. Body weight movement, resistance bands, and simple weight-bearing activity like brisk walking all send that same signal to your skeleton. Fifth, and this one is simple, Mention any of the 5 signs we covered today to your doctor at your very next visit, by name, directly. Height loss, a curving upper back, weakening grip, gum recession your dentist has mentioned, any fracture from a minor incident, past or present. Doctors are trained to take these seriously once they're raised directly. The challenge is that they're so rarely raised at all because almost nobody has ever been taught that these are the signs to bring up in the first place. Today, you have been. I want to hear from you. Of these 5 signs, which one honestly describes you or someone you love right now? Tell me in the comments, and tell me you're going to bring it up at your next appointment. Someone reading your comment next week might be the person who finally gets checked because you spoke up first. This channel exists to hand you the parts of the conversation a 15-minute appointment almost never has time for. If that's useful to you, subscribe and turn on notifications so the next one finds you. I have another one coming that walks through the everyday habits that are quietly working against your bones without you ever realizing it. Some of them things you've probably been told are healthy. One honest note before you go. Everything here is educational, not a personal diagnosis. Your own doctor is the one who can actually weigh your history against it. If anything sounded familiar, that's your reason to bring it up at your next visit, not to self-diagnose from a video. I'm Dr. Walter Hale. Take care of the parts of yourself that don't ask for attention until it's urgent. I'll see you in the next one.